Hello, everybody. This is John with Forward Talk, and we have an exciting episode that we have planned for several months for tonight, and that is the Killion-Weatherly Debate on head coverings. And we are excited today to have our first debate on Forward Talk, and we have with us Doctors Jason Weatherly and Clayton Killian, and they are both friends of mine, and they are friends with each other. So this is going to be an exciting evening of discussion. I think I think this will be the one of the first of its kind, having two Oneness Pentecostal brothers having a debate of this nature on a live stream on a channel. So we're excited about this, and we hope that we achieve our goal of demonstrating how brothers, particularly within the Oneness Pentecostal movement, can have differences publicly, yet remain respectful and remain friends. Jason and Clayton, before we get started, I'll let each of you take 60 seconds or so and kind of introduce yourself, who you are, education background, etc. But before we get started into this debate, and since Clayton is going to be going first in the discussion, we will start with him.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here. I'm Clayton. I just finished my PhD this past semester in university. So all about the Bible and historical interpretation. If you want to read some stuff that I've written, I have a blog, lectionary.blog. You can find some stuff that I've done there.
All right. Dr. Weatherly, Jason.
I'm Jason Weatherly, got a PhD in theological studies from Columbia International University, graduated in the winter of 2024. I'm an adjunct professor for Urshan University and Harvest Bible College, and my PhD dissertation is scheduled to be published through Brill in the Journal of Pentecostal Theology Supplement Series later this year. They're telling me it should be in time for the SBL conference in November, so I'm pretty excited about that. And also, I don't think this is supposed to be on the download, kind of don't say anything about it, but there's also another, I'll keep part of it kind of vague. There's also another apostolic study Bible coming out in the future, whether that's at the end of this year or early next year. And I am a contributor to the newest apostolic study Bible for the book of Ezra.
Oh, that's awesome. That is incredible. So it looks like we have a few people that are logging in live here to watch the discussion tonight. We're about to get started here in just a few moments. Those of you that are watching, I just checked. We are live on Facebook. We are live on YouTube. So whichever preferred viewing venue that you have, please take the opportunity to share those links on your different social media formats. Text those links to friends so that we can get as many people as possible involved in watching the discussion tonight. Also, please feel free. I think there should be a chat feature available. Comments throughout the debate are welcome. So we're looking forward to the discussion tonight. And at this time, we are about to get started with Dr. Clayton Killian for his 20-minute opening statement. As soon as I get my timer set here. And Clayton, as soon as you start talking, I will start my timer.
Welcome, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to defend my interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16 before you this evening. As we're getting started, I thought everyone would appreciate this little meme. This young woman asks Paul, "Why should I cover my head?" And Paul responds, "Because of the angels," but then refuses to elaborate. That is a famously tricky passage. John, if you could pull up my other slides.
Those are the only ones that I see in my queue here. Are just that that image there may be okay. I see. Yep, that's the only ones that okay, there we go. There we go. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
All right. I paused the time while I was doing that, so you didn't lose any time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So as I begin, I would like to thank John for hosting this debate and Jason for being my friendly opponent this evening. Like John said, I've known these guys for years now. I consider them both friends. And even though Jason is my intellectual adversary this evening, I'm happy to say that there's nothing adversarial about our friendship. I also want to say from the outset that even though I believe this topic is very important, I do not think it is an issue over which we should break fellowship. The vast majority of the women in my local church do not wear head coverings, and my pastor's interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11 would be basically the same as Jason's, but even still, we're brothers in Christ, even if we come to different interpretations about this passage of Scripture. So, for tonight's debate, I have an ambitious goal and a modest goal. My ambitious goal is to convince Jason that my understanding of 1 Corinthians 11 is correct, and to convince Jason so thoroughly that he rewrites his book about hair into a defense of head coverings. My more modest goal is to explain why I interpret 1 Corinthians 11 the way that I do, and I'll leave it up to the viewer whether or not I succeed. The proposition I would like to advance this evening is that 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16 regulates both the Christian's hair as well as the Christian's headwear. The crucial question in tonight's debate is this: what is the covering, or what are the coverings described in 1 Corinthians 11? Everything hinges on this. Whereas Jason believes that 1 Corinthians 11 is entirely and exclusively about hair, I believe that this passage also discusses head coverings. Specifically, I argue that 1 Corinthians 11 instructs men to keep their hair cut short and to take off any sort of head covering while praying or prophesying. And this passage instructs women to allow their hair to grow long and to put on a head covering while praying or prophesying. Now, to clarify, when I say head covering, I mean any article of clothing that is worn on the head. This would include hats, hoods, veils, and so forth. When men pray, Paul instructs men to take their hats off, to uncover their heads. But when women pray, Paul instructs women to put something on, to cover their heads. Before explaining why I interpret the passage in this way, I need to point out one detail that might become important as we move through this evening's discussion. Many interpreters approach 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, as if Paul is correcting a problem or he's rebuking Corinthian misbehavior. But this is not the case. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 3, Paul says, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand," the Greek word is adenai, I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. So whatever this passage teaches, whether it's hair, whether it's head covering, Paul praises the Corinthians because they're already doing whatever this passage is about. The passage is written not to make the Corinthians start or stop doing something, but so that they will understand the practice that they're already doing. Now, with that in mind, I'll now explain why 1 Corinthians 11 is not simply talking about hair, but also discusses head coverings. Now, plainly, Paul does mention hair several times throughout the passage, right? Whenever he talks about being shaved or being shorn, having her hair cut, obviously that's what's done to hair. And in verses 13 through 15, he talks about it's a shame for a man to have long hair, but it's a glory for women to have long hair. But Paul also repeatedly speaks about a head covering. The ways that Paul speaks about this covering makes it clear that he's talking about something other than hair, an item of headwear that can be put on or removed. In verses 4 and 5, Paul connects head covering to the actions of prayer and prophecy. It is not disgraceful for a man to cover his head, pure and simple, but it is disgraceful for a man to cover his head while praying and prophesying. Likewise, it's not disgraceful for a woman to uncover her head. A woman does not have to constantly wear a hat, but it is disgraceful for a woman to uncover her head while praying and prophesying. The covering that Paul has in mind is a covering that a man can easily take off when he prays and put back on when he's done praying. It's a covering that a woman can put on while she prays and take off again when she's done praying. Now, notice that Paul's requirements concerning head coverings are time-specific, not perpetual. Paul does not require the man to always be uncovered, but only when praying or prophesying. And unlike Muslims and some Jews, Paul does not require women to be veiled at all times, but only when praying or prophesying. This shows that Paul is talking about head covering in these verses, not hair. Unlike a hat or a veil or a hood or something like that, hair is a relatively permanent part of our body. We can cut it off or we can let it grow, but we can't just put it on and take it off and then put it back on again at will. Furthermore, Paul's statements about hair later in the chapter are not time specific. I'm sure that Jason would agree with me that it's always shameful for a woman to shave her head. It's not just shameful to do that when she prays. I'm sure Jason agrees that it's always shameful for a man to have long hair, not just when he's praying or prophesying. So if verses 4 and 5 are only talking about hair, it makes no sense to stipulate a specific timing. What we do with our hair is always shameful, but what we do with a hat or a head covering of some kind is not. In verse 4, Paul says, when Paul says with something on his head or having his head covered, he uses the Greek phrase kata kephales echon. Now, translated literally, this phrase would mean having down the head or having on or having against the head. So the question naturally becomes, having what down the head? Jason answers this question with long hair, having long hair hanging down the head. But when we look at how this phrase or similar wording is used elsewhere in Greek literature, we see that it almost certainly refers to a head covering. In the Greek translation of the book of Esther, after Haman had to lead Mordecai through the city on horseback, proclaiming, this is how the man will be treated in whom the king places his favor. Haman is so embarrassed that Esther 6:12 says that he hurried home having his head covered. Now, in the ancient Greek translation, in the Septuagint version of Esther, it uses Paul's phrase, kata kephales. Obviously, Haman did not grow his hair out long over the course of one afternoon. Rather, Haman is so embarrassed that he's covering his head with a hood or a garment or some sort of head covering. Likewise, the Roman philosopher and biographer Plutarch repeatedly uses similar language to describe people covering their heads with a garment. Sulpicius Gallus divorced his wife, according to Plutarch, because he saw her pull her cloak over her head. And again, he uses that phrase, kata kephales. Scipio walked with his toga covering his head. And this uses kata kephales echon again. Plutarch's quotations are especially noteworthy because Paul and Plutarch lived at the same time. Plutarch was only about 20 years older than Paul, so this shows us how this phrase would have been used by Greek speakers at Paul's time. Now, some scholars have suggested that the phrase kata kephales echon is used to condemn men who were wearing long hair in an effeminate style. But Dr. Gordon Fee points out that Paul's wording in 1 Corinthians 11 is completely different from descriptions of long-haired men elsewhere. To quote Dr. Fee's commentary, the problem with this, however, is that these passages always refer to hair and never remotely resemble the language Paul uses here in 1 Corinthians 11. If Paul had intended long hair, this idiom, having down the head, or katakephiles, is a most unusual way of referring to it. Almost certainly, therefore, by this idiom, Paul is referring to an external cloth covering. In verses 5 and 13, Paul describes a woman who has her head uncovered with the Greek adjective akatakaluptos. In its entry for this word, the BDAG lexicon translates verse 13 as a woman without a head covering, and BDAG is the standard lexicon for New Testament studies. Again, when we look at how this word is used in other Greek literature, we see that akatakaluptos is most likely referring to removing a head covering. To give just one example, Philo was a prominent Greek-speaking Jewish intellectual from Alexandria, Egypt, who was a bit older than Paul. He died about 15 years before Paul did. In his book on the special laws, Philo summarizes the adultery test from Numbers 5, which was a ritual in the Old Testament to determine if a wife had been unfaithful to her husband. As part of this ritual, God told the priest to uncover the woman's head, Numbers 5:18. In his discussion of this passage, Philo uses the identical phrase that Paul uses in verse 5, akatakalupto te kephale. You can see it there. Philo writes, when these preliminaries are completed, the woman is to come forward with her head uncovered, there's Paul's phrase, bringing the barley meal as has been said. We know that Philo is describing the removal of a head covering because earlier in the passage he makes it explicit. The priest, taking the offering, hands it to the woman and removes her kerchief, removes her head covering, in order that she may be judged with her head bared. Here we have another Greek-speaking Jew from the first century who uses the exact phrase that Paul does to describe the removal of a head covering. Again, this shows us how Paul's wording would have been understood by other Greek speakers of his day. The adjective uncovered, or akatakaluptos, also occurs in the Septuagint version of Leviticus 13:45, where the leper is commanded to have his head bare. The context here is dealing with clothing, because the man is also expected to tear his robes and to wear something covering his top lip. This adds to the pattern that we're beginning to see in 1 Corinthians 11, that the passage seems to be speaking about an external material covering, not about hair alone. In verses 6 and 7, Paul uses the verb katakalupto 3 times to discuss women and men covering their heads. Paul commands the women, let her cover her head. He says that if a woman does not cover her head, she may as well cut her hair off, and he commands the men that they ought not to have his head covered. The verb katakalupto seems to be a general word for covering. If you look through the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this is the word that's used to describe like a large group of people covering the land, or water covering the sea. That said, there are times in the Old Testament where this word clearly refers to a veil. In Genesis 38, Judah did not recognize his daughter-in-law Tamar because she had veiled her face, katakalupto. The Old Testament uses katakalupto several times to refer to the veil that covered the Holy of Holies. And in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul uses the noun kaluma, the noun veil, and it shares the same root as katakalupto when it describes the veil that Moses put over his face. Now, to remind us of the quote from Gordon Fee earlier, if Paul had intended long hair, this is the most unusual way of referring to it. In all of my research, I have not been able to find a single instance in Greek literature where the verb katakalupto that Paul uses here is used to describe long hair hanging down the head. In verses 5 and 6, we get our first mention of hair. Now, the actual word hair is not used, but it's implicit in the terms shorn or shaven. When Paul compares a woman praying without a head covering to the radical action of cutting off her hair, he says that these are one and the same. Now, I expect we'll spend a fair bit of time here in the rebuttal and the cross-examination. This is one of the linchpin verses. What does this mean? In order for Jason's interpretation to work, the word uncovered cannot mean to take off a head covering. Instead, uncovered must be made to mean cut the hair. And here's how Jason gets there. Jason sees shorn and shaven in the passage, and he correctly infers that this involves hair. hair is what we cut or what we shave. But then Jason sees the phrase one and the same, and he interprets this literally rather than simply as a point of comparison. I expect Jason to really emphasize this one and the same point, and if he doesn't, I'll be very surprised. Now, in order for uncovered to be one and the same, identical with being shaved, then that means the covering material also has to be hair. So being uncovered must mean cutting the hair at all. So Jason sees a pattern of intensifying. Being uncovered, so cutting the hair at all, being shorn, cutting the hair short, and being shaved, cutting hair all the way down to the skin. Jason's interpretation of this verse could be paraphrased this way: but every woman who prays or prophesies with her hair cut, any at all, dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman cuts her hair any at all, let her also cut her hair short. But if it is shameful for a woman to cut her hair short or be shaved, she should not cut it at all. The problem with Jason's interpretation is that verse 5 does not say uncovered is one and the same with being cut any at all. The verse says that uncovered is one and the same with being shaved. If one and the same literally means identical with, as Jason has argued elsewhere, then this would actually equate uncovered with shaved, not with cut. If Jason is right about taking this literally, it completely undermines the hair-only doctrine. So according to Jason, uncovered equals, if we're taking this literally, uncovered would mean shaved, then covered would mean not shaved. When we apply this, look at what happens to the passage. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is shaved, because remember, uncovered is one and the same with being shaved, let her also cut her hair short. But if it is shameful for a woman to cut her hair short or be shaved, let her be unshaven. This would mean that as long as a woman does not shave her head is still covered. But that's not what Jason believes. And looking at verse 6, how is a woman supposed to also, notice the word also, cut her hair short if her head is already shaved? In fact, if this is the case, then I would need to shave my head bald. I need to adopt Jason's hairstyle if I'm to pray with an uncovered head, if it really is one and the same. Now, obviously, this does not work. Instead, one and the same should be taken as a point of comparison. Being uncovered is not literally the same as being shaved. Rather, it's comparable. If a woman wants to pray with her head uncovered, she may as well go all the way and shave her hair off as well. This interpretation doesn't muddle the passage, and it recognizes the comparison between the natural covering, which is the hair, and the religious covering, which would be a hat or a hood. Now, in verses 7 and 10, Paul tells men that they ought not to cover their heads, but he tells women that they ought to have a symbol of authority on their heads. If you read through 1 Corinthians 11, you notice a pattern of opposites. What men are supposed to do, women are not supposed to do. What women are supposed to do, men are not supposed to do. Here, we're seeing the exact same thing. Men are supposed to veil their heads. Notice the use of katakalupto. It's the same as earlier.
1 minute, Clayton.
Okay. And women are supposed to veil their heads. Now, before concluding, I want to talk just a little bit about the preposition anti. In order for Jason's interpretation to work, anti has to mean strict replacement, but this word can also denote equivalence. For example, in Matthew 5:38, we have the phrase "an eye for an eye." Now, obviously, the second man's eye does not replace the first man's eye. Rather, two eyes are missing, right? There's a comparable penalty. When Jesus told Peter, Peter catches the fish and there's a coin in its mouth, the coin does not replace Peter and Jesus. Rather, it pays the tax debt that they owe. So I would say that in conclusion, all of this covering terminology is used. It makes no sense.
You can finish that thought real quick.
Okay. It makes no sense for all of this covering terminology to be in the passage if the passage is only about hair.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Killion, for that opening statement. We have a group that are watching the debate live with us. We appreciate you tuning in, some comments. We appreciate you being active in the discussion as participants. Please continue to do so. Take the opportunity to share the link on your social medias. Text a link either from the YouTube channel or Facebook Live with a friend that you think might be interested in the discussion. And Jason, it is now going to be your time for your opening presentation. And like with Clayton, as soon as you start talking, I will hit the start button. Go ahead, Dr. Weatherly.
Can you go ahead and get the presentation up?
Oh, yeah, that would probably help, wouldn't it? There we go.
So it's good to be here. Thank you, John. Thank you, Clayton. I want to echo the thoughts that Clayton said. We are friends, and that's why I'm calling him Clayton, and he can call me Jason. No titles needed. We've been friends for quite some time. We're going to continue to be friends. And this is a little bit different format than what you may be used to, because in a traditional debate setting, you have one proposition, one person affirms, the other person denies, and then the other night or in the other session, if there's two sessions on the same topic, the other person affirms and then the other person denies. So in this format, which is kind of the norm for online debating, this is my first time doing an online debate. I've had several in-person live debates before where we did the traditional one person affirm, one person denies. But in this format, we're kind of both affirming. So he's made an opening statement for his position. I make an opening statement for my position. Then we'll both offer some rebuttals, and then we'll have some cross-examination, the little Q&A after that. I do want to say, I'm not sure if it showed up on Clayton's side while he was presenting, but when the comments were coming through, sometimes they kind of overpower the slides. So if you don't mind, keep the comments to a minimum. Otherwise, I'm going to lose track of what's written on the slide. So my position, of course, is that
I will keep the comments from coming on the screen. They will still show up here, but I'll keep them from coming on the screen so as not to distract you.
Okay, thank you. So my position is that 1 Corinthians 11, 3-16, that the only required covering is a woman's long hair. I will say that by long hair, I do mean long uncut hair. And I don't think that Clayton and I will have a disagreement on the fact that long hair should be uncut. I don't think we do. But 1 Corinthians 11:4 starts off, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Notice it does not say every man when they pray or when they prophesy. It is praying or prophesying. That's a participle, and I'll talk more about that in the follow-up. But the text says every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, and having his head covered is more of a commentary than a translation, because the Greek text is kata kephiles ekon, having something. So ekon is having, and then kata is down or down from his head. It's not upon the head. That's the Greek preposition epi. And there are various instances throughout the New Testament of crowns upon the head, a napkin upon the head, and that is the Greek preposition epi. So here it is simply having something, the things not mentioned, down from the head. It's not specified what that something is yet. So Paul is not specific. It's not wearing something on the head. It is having something. We don't know what the something is yet, down the head. Then he says, for the woman, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if she were shaven. The word uncovered is akatakalupto, meaning not, and katakalupto meaning wholly covered or completely covered. Kata as a preposition, prepositions can be added as a prefix to a verb to show intensity. And so when kata is added to kalupto, it's not just covered, it's wholly covered, as defined by Strong's, or completely covered as defined by W.J. Hickey. So again, akatakalupto does not necessarily indicate the covering material. And at this point, we don't know what the covering material is. And I think Paul is being kind of ambiguous on purpose here. So he says in 1 Corinthians 11:5, but every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if she were shaven. And Clayton, he's not a prophet or a son of a prophet. He's just heard me before and read my book. So I want you to notice that the New King James says that is one as if she were shaven. But I want you to notice the Greek text, that there's no as if statement of comparison. Now, it's not, we'll talk more in the Q&A about his argument about shaven. But I will say that if that's the way he wants to go, then it's still hair. So the Greek text literally says, for it is one and the same having been shaven. And as a matter of fact, the New King James translates it here as one and the same. In other words, for a woman to be uncovered is one and the same as shaven. The comparison here, even the showing of comparison, is not with something that is removable. It's something that is cut or shaven. It is one and the same as shaven. We're not talking about something that's simply comparable or making a figurative reference to. We're talking about something that is one and the same as shaven. So what is shaven? It's hair. And so the only way that uncovered can be one and the same with being shaven is for the material, the covering, to be hair. And so the idea of one and the same, the Common English Bible translates this as every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. 1 Corinthians 11:5 from the Holman Christian Standard Bible, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is one and the same as having her head shaved. The NIV says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. What is it that's shaved? It's hair. 1 Corinthians 11:5 from the Concordant Little Translation says, yet every woman praying or prophesying with uncovered head is disgracing her head, for it is one and the same as being shaven. So again, the only way that uncovered can be one and the same, uncovered has reference to a woman's hair. And we'll see that a little more in the logical argument that Paul makes. And so again, from the Greek text, one and the same, the one shaven. And from Thayer's lexicon, he says that it is the same. And it takes after it a dative of the person when it denotes the same or identical with, as 1 Corinthians 11:5. So again, what is it that is shaven? It is hair. So this is the same phrase that Paul uses one chapter later, 1 Corinthians 12:11, one and the same Spirit. In the argument in 1 Corinthians 12 about the diversities of the gifts, the 9 or so gifts of the Spirit, to one is given a word of wisdom, to another is given a word of knowledge, to one person is given discerning of spirits, to another person is giving gifts of healings, to another person is giving miracle workings. But Paul concludes and he says, but it's the one and the same Spirit. So there has to be a commonality between here, to the point of it being the same, to the point, especially in 1 Corinthians 12:11, identical with. So we're not taking two things that are opposed to each other, such as hair and a material covering. We're talking about something that is the same in the sense of Paul using a one and the same or identical language here. It is one and the same. It's the same phrase as 1 Corinthians 12:11. So Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 11:6, he says, if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. And so the phrase let her also be shorn is not a command for her to cut her hair short. Rather, Paul is saying that this is the logical conclusion. So he is explaining the phrase that it is one and the same as shaven. He's going a little further in his explanation, for If a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. So the phrase let her be shorn is not a command for a woman to cut her hair. Rather, it's Paul's logical conclusion of what consistency demands if the woman is not wholly covered. In other words, Paul is making a logical argument. He's saying if you're going to do A, then you might as well do B. And B is something that is more severe than A. And since it is a shame to do B, don't even do A. So if a woman is not fully covered, then she might as well cut her hair short. So cutting her hair short is the next step in this logical conclusion. But since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So again, the context of a woman being covered is dealing with that which can be shorn or shaven, and that is hair. So notice that Paul said that if a woman is not covered, then she might as well be shorn. And the word shorn here is the Greek word kero, which means to cut the hair short. This word is used most often for shearing the wool from sheep. And so Thayer in his lexicon, page 343, says that kero in 1 Corinthians 11:6 absolutely refers to cutting short the hair of the head. It's not simply cutting the hair. I've heard some people say, well, that doesn't make any sense if you say it's hair, because if a woman cuts her hair, let her cut her hair. No. If a woman's not covered, let her be cut short. The word shorn, kero, means cut short. So watch this. Paul's argument of logical consistency takes us from one act to a more severe act. So if you're going to do A, you might as well do B. And B is more severe than A. So don't even do A. So we were going to look at a false antithesis here. So what is the one severe act that brings us to another severe act? So it's a false antithesis to say that if you don't wear a veil, a woman might as well cut her hair short. But since it's a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her wear a veil. You might as well tell someone that if you don't wear sunglasses, you might as well shave your eyebrows. There's not an equal relationship between those two. But since it is a shame to shave your eyebrows, you should wear sunglasses. So let me show you a true antithesis. A true antithesis would be something like this. If you steal a piece of bubble gum, so that's the A, you might as well rob a bank. So now we're taking you to something more severe. One act to a similar severe act. One in the same act, but it's more severe. But since robbing a bank is a felony, don't even steal a piece of bubble gum. And then another example would be if a woman goes out in a halter top, she might as well go out naked. But since it is a shame to go naked, let her not go out in a halter top. So in both of these antitheses, we have equal relationship on both sides. So in the first one, stealing a piece of bubble gum, if you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, you might as well rob a bank. You might as well steal money from a bank. But since stealing money, so in both contexts, we're talking about stealing money, but since stealing money from a bank or robbing a bank is a felony, don't even steal a piece of bubble gum. And the same thing with if a woman goes out in a halter top, so partial nudity, she might as well go out naked, full nudity. And so since it's a shame to go out naked, full nudity, don't even go out in the halter top. We're teaching a life lesson with a logical conclusion of where this is going to lead us to from doing one thing to the next. We're going from one act to a more severe act that's a shameful act. And since this act is a shame, don't even go do the first act. From point 1 to point 2 to point 3, if you're going to do this, if you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, number 1, you might as well rob a bank. Number 2, but since robbing a bank is a felony, don't even do the first act. Don't even steal a piece of bubble gum. And so this is the argument that Paul is making in 1 Corinthians chapter 11:6. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. What is shorn? Hair. We're talking about something that is cut short. So if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn or cut short. He's saying if you're not covered, you might as well be cut short, which is where the logical conclusion goes, to the more severe act. But since it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. So here is a true antithesis. If a woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut it short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, by the way, the word "but since" in the King James, New King James says "but if." It's the Greek phrase "ede," and it means "but since." Paul's not questioning whether it is. He's making a rhetorical statement that it is. It is shameful for a woman to be cut short or shaved. So Paul says if a woman cuts her hair any length, not covered, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her not cut her hair at all. So here we have a true antithesis because we have equal relationship on both sides, and that is cutting the hair. It's a valid argument because Paul is taking us from one act, the minor act of trimming or cutting the hair any length, to a more severe act of cutting the hair short. Then Paul argues that since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her not even do the first act, which is trimming or cutting the hair any length. And so Paul's argument is that the head covering, whatever that covering is something that can be shaven. It is something that can be shorn or shaven. Had Paul just said shaven, Clayton may have an argument here, but he prefaces that in the next verse of shorn or shaven. And so he's taking us from one act to a more severe act. And that which is shorn or shaven is hair, showing that the covering is hair. The covering in question is hair. And so Paul, he sums all this up in verse 13. He says, judge among yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered? Akatakaluptas. So this whole man prophesying or praying man having something down the head, praying or prophesying woman not being fully covered, dishonoring her head, that's all the same as if she was shaven. And he takes us through this logical argument of conclusion that if you're going to do this, you might as well do this. But since this is a shame, don't even do this. And in every reference there, it is something that can be shorn or shaven, and that's hair. And then Paul sums all this up by saying, judge among yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God uncovered? Then he answers that exact statement, that rhetorical question, in the next two verses. He says, does not even nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So at the conclusion of all of this matter, Paul concludes that a woman's hair, the properness of a woman praying to God uncovered, is that her long hair is given to her for a covering. Thus, a woman's long hair fulfills the injunction of let her be covered. And so when a woman refrains from cutting or trimming her hair, she has fulfilled the apostolic biblical mandate of having her head covered. And so Paul concludes all of this by saying, here's the conclusion of it. Judge among yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God uncovered? And then he gets to the point for the very end of his argumentation. Doesn't nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, that's what can be shorn or shaven, that it dishonors him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. John, I don't know how much time I've got left.
You have 1 minute and 7 seconds.
Great. I will pass the time in my 1 minute and 7 seconds by saying once again, it's good to be a part of this discussion. And I agree with Clayton that I don't make this an issue of fellowship either. I told John and Clayton last night, I'm more interested in keeping my friends than making enemies over an issue like this. So anyway, I will give this back over to John.
All right, sounds good. Great opening, Dr. Weatherly. I appreciate the that first speech. I think we are now going to be moving into the first rebuttals. Correct? 10-minute rebuttals, and we will get those started in just a moment. In the meantime,
I think it's 20-minute rebuttals.
20-minute rebuttals. Okay.
Yep.
So in the meantime, we will. Just want to say appreciate all the comments that are coming in that I see, people actively participating. We're hovering at around 30 people watching live, so that's nice. Take the opportunity to share the conversation with someone. The most important part of this, or the most exciting part of this format, is going to be coming up in the cross exam. So let's get some more people in here to watch this. It's a great discussion so far. Dr. Killion, when you are ready to start speaking, I will start the timer.
Thanks, Jason. That was a great opening. A lot of good points. I'm eager to respond. So one minor thing I would say is that the preposition kata can refer to something being on the head. That's not maybe as common as epi. We would expect to see epi a lot of times. But the preposition kata can mean against, like two things being against one another. And so it can refer to something resting against the top of the head. Since you mention epi, I will point out that in 1 Corinthians 11:10, it says, "For this cause ought the woman to have power, exousia, on her head, epi tes kephales." So if we're saying that the preposition epi refers to like a secondary object setting on top of the head, that's the exact language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 11:10. And as I showed in my opening, verse 10 is paralleled with verse 7. The man ought not to cover his head. The man ought not katakalupto, and the woman ought to have something on her head, epites kephales. So the man is told not to wear a head covering using the verb katakalupto, and the woman is told to have a symbol of authority on her head, and it uses the preposition epi, as you said. Now, I agree about verse 4, that if we're just looking at the phrase having down the head, kata tes kephales, kata kephales echon, that does not necessarily tell us, just looking at it, what the covering is. Like, it's fair to ask, having what down the head? The thing is, this is a pretty standard phrase to refer to having a hood or having a toga or having a hat on the head. This, we would expect to see this phrase with some sort of head covering. I gave, I think, 4 examples, 1 from the Septuagint and 3 from a contemporary of Paul. So if we're looking at how the Bible uses this terminology, and if we're looking at how other people in Paul's day are using this terminology, kata kephales echon is not talking about long hair hanging down from the head. It's talking about your cloak that you can pull up over your head because you're embarrassed, like Haman did. It's talking about pulling your toga up over your head like Scipio did so that he can travel without being recognized. It's referring to an article of clothing. About verse 5, now I really want to press on this and lean on this. So expect some questions about this in the cross-examination, where it says that every woman praying or prophesying, having her head uncovered, dishonors her head, because it is one and the same as being shaved. Now, Jason, in your in your presentation, you treated the word uncovered as if it meant to cut the hair any at all. But that's if we're taking one and the same in a literal equative manner, that these are literally one and the same identical. One and the same identical. Paul doesn't equate being uncovered with trimming the hair. He equates being uncovered with shaving off the hair. So if we're going to go through the passage and say, well, uncovered is talking about hair, it's talking about shaving off the hair. And if that's the case, verse 6 makes absolutely no sense if we say, for if the woman be not covered, and again, not covered means shaved, because Paul said being uncovered is one and the same. It's identical with being shaved. So if the woman is not shaved, let her also be shorn. That doesn't make any sense. How can you cut your hair short if your hair is already shaved off, right? This shows us that the phrase one and the same, if we take it literally, it completely inverts the hair only doctrine. It just doesn't make sense. So the phrase one and the same has to be flexible here. Now, I agree, in the next chapter, in chapter 12, where Paul says it's one and the same Spirit that gives, different gifts to different people. In that context, he's obviously emphasizing something that's identical, but it can't be the case here, because if it is, then you have Paul telling women, if you're going to shave your hair, then you should also cut it short, which doesn't make sense at all. I would suggest, my argument would be that the reason one and the same works here is because the emphasis is not on similarity of action. It's not that you have a less severe action moving to a more severe action, but rather the reason you can say that taking off a head covering is one and the same with being shaved is because the shame involved in both actions, that's the thing that's identical. It's not that the actions themselves are on a sliding scale of intensity from trimming all the way up to, your hairstyle, Jason. Rather, it's that even though these actions are, in one sense dissimilar, I agree with you. It's not identically the same thing to shave your head versus to take off a hat. But the reason Paul is able to equate those is because the shame involved in both of those actions is the same. Now, to give an example of this, later in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul rebukes the Corinthians for shaming one another during communion. He talks about the wealthier people were going first and they were eating up all the food, and so the poorer people were not able to take any of the Lord's Supper. And Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11:22, what, do you not have houses to eat and to drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame them which have not? And the word shame there is katiskuno, and it's the same word that Paul uses in verse 5 when he says, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, it would make total sense if I said, hey, you would not go up to this person and shave off all of their head, right? You wouldn't go up to brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so and just shave off all of their head, all of their hair off their head. No, you would never do that. That's horribly embarrassing. So then you shouldn't shame them during communion either. You shouldn't be making them feel bad for their poverty during communion either, right? And the reason that you can make an equation like that is not because those two actions are the same. Shaving someone's head and making fun of them for being poor, right? Those are totally different actions, but it's the same shame. And Paul even uses the same word. So that's why there's able to be an equation here. And I don't see a way around this. If one and the same really is like literally identically being uncovered is being shaved, then a woman's head is not uncovered up to the point of shaving. She can cut her hair as far as she likes, and until it's shaved, it's not uncovered, because being uncovered is one and the same, identical with being shaved. I can keep my hair as short as I want it, and until I shave my hair all the way off, I'm not uncovered, because being uncovered is one and the same with being shaved. I would say, let's see here. In verse 15, where it says that her hair is given to her for a covering, the equative, like the exchange view, treats long hair as if it's an exchange for a covering, right? You have long hair instead of a covering; it replaces the covering. Rather, the more the better option would be to take this as comparable. And if we do this, it makes more sense of verses 13 and 14. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a shame unto him? The reason that nature is able to be a teacher is because there's an analogy, there's a comparison between the natural covering, which is long hair, and the religious covering, which would be the head covering or the veil. I would like to, let's see here. And another thing I would like to press is that if Paul is only talking about hair, what sense does it make for him to use all of this language of covering throughout the passage, right? Paul starts off in verse 4 with the phrase having his head covered, which in the Greek of the time most naturally refers to a head covering. In verse 5, he talks about a woman praying or prophesying, having her head uncovered. He uses a verb that most naturally refers to a physical head covering. I've not been able to find a single instance of hair being used as the object of this word. Paul uses all of this covering language, and then we're supposed to believe that he speaks for half a chapter about covering, and then we get to verse 15 and, oh, long hair replaces the covering. We don't need to worry about it. To me, that just doesn't make any sense at all. If Paul was only speaking about hair, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16 could have been 2 sentences. Men, do not wear long hair. Women, do not cut your hair, right? It could have been simple, to the point. There would be no need for all of this language of covering. I submit that the reason that Paul uses the language of covering and the language of hair, there's a very simple reason for this. It's because he's talking about 2 things. He's talking about a head covering, and he's talking about hair. And so when we get to the preposition anti in verse 15, it's not that he is replacing one with the other, just like the coin that Jesus paid his taxes with did not replace Jesus, right? It just fulfilled his obligation. Whenever the Old Testament uses the phrase an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, that's the preposition anti there, right? Obviously, the second man's eye does not replace the first man's eye. Each man has an eye missing. There's 2 missing eyes, and I'm submitting that there's 2 coverings here as well. John, I'm content to yield the rest of my rebuttal time.
Are you sure?
Yes, but I will say one thing before I do, and that's just to return to the point about epi that Jason mentioned at the very beginning. If we're saying kata kephiles echon is ambiguous, the preposition kata is ambiguous, and so it doesn't necessarily have to refer to something on the head. The clearer preposition epi is used in verse 10, right? So it would be definitely talking about a head covering on the head, and that's paralleled with what the man is not supposed to do in verse 7. Verses 7 and 10 use the language of ought, right? The man ought not to cover his head versus the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. This is the language of moral obligation. And so if the woman is supposed to wear a head covering, the man is not supposed to wear a head covering.
Okay, you good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You had 5 minutes left, so thank you for that rebuttal. That was an excellent rebuttal. One more time, please take the opportunity to share with your friends on social media. Text them a link to either the Facebook or the YouTube stream of this debate. I am enjoying this thoroughly. It has been so good. I'm getting text on my phone. I'm getting comments in the sidebar here. So this is really exciting. All right, Jason. Whenever, let me restart. Let me restart this timer. All right. So whenever you are ready for your rebuttal to begin, as soon as you start talking, I will start the clock.
Okay, so not necessarily an argument, just a counterpoint, a different view where Clayton started off about praise. Is Paul praising or is he correcting them? I think Clayton has overlooked thelo de, but I want you to know. Now I praise you, brethren, but then he says, but I want you to know. So it's kind of like saying, Clayton, you did a really good job, but I want you to know. So it's not necessarily a praise. He's setting them up. And so even David Garland in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he says that his affirmation of them is not ironic, but designated to placate them so that they will be receptive to critical advice. And then Keener says, it was a good rhetorical practice to start the subject with something commend or praise before you move on. But even here, not all is good. I want you to know. So he's not necessarily just patting them on the back for everything. There is a corrective element. That's not an argument either way. It's just a different, just information on verses 2 through 3. All right. So I want to point out that it does not say, 1 Corinthians 11, 4 through 5 does not say when a man prays or prophesies. It says every praying man, every praying or prophesying man, praying or prophesying woman. These are participles. Praying and prophesying describe the man and the woman. It's not when a man prays as if we're singling out this is the time in which it has to be done. The participles praying and prophesying describe the man or woman. For example, for those of you that don't know, our illustrious host, his dad, John Carroll, is commonly known as a praying man. Now, Elder Carroll is known as a praying man because he prays, not only when he prays. So praying or prophesying man, praying or prophesying woman does not limit the context to the religious service, but it describes the person. And the participles are used like this in the Septuagint. Abel Isaacson points this out in his work. And so in Jeremiah, the Septuagint 29:26, every prophesying man is a reference to every prophet. And then Ezekiel 13:17, the daughters, the ones prophesying, is a reference to the prophetess. So praying and prophesying don't limit what Paul's saying to the time when they pray or prophesy. These participles are descriptive of the man and the woman. Every praying man, every praying or prophesying man, or a prophet, or a praying or prophesying woman. All right, so he mentioned. Let me first say he talked about Plutarch and those that wrote as contemporaries of Paul. For those of you that that can't read Greek and you don't know the text, we know that Plutarch's talking about an artificial garment because he specifically uses the word hemation. So the word hemation is what lets us know that we're talking about an artificial garment. Esther 6:12 is not identical to 1 Corinthians 11:4. Esther 6:12 says mourning down ahead. 1 Corinthians 11:4 says having something down the head. Kata, kephiles, ekon. So they're not identical in terminology. Even though they use kata and they both use kephiles, Esther uses the word mourning. Haman went away mourning down ahead. It could mean that he covered with his toga. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. There's no word hemation there. I don't believe there is. And so notice how the Good News Bible translates Esther 6:12. It says, Haman hurried home, covering his face in embarrassment. You don't have to use a veil to cover your face. The Common English Version, or Centennial English Version, I believe it is, says that Haman hurried home, hiding his face in shame. You don't have to put on a material to hide your face. The word kata may not even refer to something over the head at all, because the Apostolic Bible Polyglot, which is a translation of the Septuagint, says Haman returned to his own place, fretting with a downcast head. So it's not the exact same terminology. And it could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. And again, for Plutarch, he uses the specific word hemation. So we know that in Plutarch, he pulled his toga up and he pulled it up and he covered his face because they told him to drop it so we can see your face, your prosopon. But again, in Plutarch, he has a specific garment there, hemation. But in 1 Corinthians 11:4, there's nothing like that. It's just kata, kephiles, ekon. It is not identical to Esther 6:12 and is not identical to Plutarch. So Esther 6:12, mourning down ahead, is no more identical with 1 Corinthians 11:4, having something down the head, as either one of these are to Mark 14:3, which also uses kata, kephiles, poured down his head. So just because it uses kata and kephiles doesn't mean the passages are identical or have the exact same context. All right, so these terms, kata kalupto, they can refer to a veil or a piece of clothing. No one's denying that. How do we know that kata kalupto is referring to an artificial covering? For example, he had mentioned Genesis 38, 14-5. Tamar, she took off her widow's garment. She covered herself with a veil. And then when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot because she had covered, kata kalupto, her face. So how do we know that kata kalupto there is talking about an artificial covering? Because it has the word veil. And this was a garment that covered her face. So in the immediate context, there is a word for an artificial piece of clothing. What's in the context of 1 Corinthians 11 is simply that which can be shorn or shaven. Kata kalupto appears 24 times, or in 24 verses in the Old Testament. Only 3 times it refers to a veil. 2 of those, it's referring to the Ark of the Covenant. 7 times kata kalupto refers to the fat covering the belly. 5 times it refers to water. Each time it's the context that tells us what is the covering. Kalupto appears 75 times in the Septuagint. So kalupto appears 75 times, and flip my sheet here. 11 of those times it's referring to a cloud, and each time the context tells us what the covering is. So the verb kata kalupto appears 75 times in the Septuagint. 11 of those is a cloud. 10 refers to water. 9 refers to sin or iniquity or shame. 5 refers to darkness. 5 is calamity or trouble. 5 of them are the tents or the skins of the tabernacle. 3 times it's blood. Blood covers the ground. 3 times it's earth or dirt. 3 times it's reference to the plagues covering Egypt. Sometimes it refers to a just lip or virtue. Twice it refers to leprosy covering the body. Twice it refers to a cloak. 1 time it refers to the quails One time it refers to covering a pit, refers to covering the body parts with pants. It refers to covering the people with the earth. It refers to fatness, wings, mountains, tears. It even refers to hair. Kalupto in Ezekiel in the Septuagint refers to hair. So in Ezekiel, in the Septuagint, so this word can reference hair. The verb or the verb kalupto occurs twice in the Septuagint version of Ezekiel 44:20 in the phrase kaluptantes kalupsusin, to carefully cover, which translates the Hebrew verb kasam, which means to shave or to shear. And in the context of Ezekiel 44:20, kasam and its Greek equivalents mean cutting or trimming the hair neatly. So kalupto definitely refers to the hair in this passage. Also in Leviticus 13:41 in the Septuagint, it also uses kata prosopone and kephale to refer to the hair, because it refers to hair not hanging down the face or in the hair. So kata in Leviticus 13:41 also refers to hair. So in each of these passages, the context tells us what kalupto, kata kalupto, all of these words are referring to what the covering is. And in the context of 1 Corinthians 11:4-5, the covering material is definitely that which can be shorn or shaven. So again, we go back to Paul's logical argument. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if she was shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But it's shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaven. Let her be covered. So he is making this logical argument of conclusion that if a woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut it short. But since it is shameful for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her not cut her hair at all. So back to this, Clayton, I will say you do have a good argument on one and the same. However, if you're going to be flexible on one on the same, be flexible with the whole context, because one and the same is not only used in 1 Corinthians 12 for one and the same Spirit, it's also used in 1 Corinthians 10:4, where they all drank from one and the same rock. And it's also used in Philippians 2:8 for one and the same reason. So if all Paul said was being uncovered is one and the same as being shaven, you would have a point, but he doesn't. He goes on and says, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But it's shameful for a woman to be shorn and shaved. So he starts with the premise here, and that premise is something that can be shorn, and then he further elaborates on it in the next verse. So if you're going to be flexible on one and the same, be flexible on the whole context of it, and that it would also, he explains it even more in the next statement, including shorn or shaven. And so in his logical argument of conclusion, being uncovered, if you're going to be uncovered, it takes you to the next severe act, which is being shorn, cutting the hair short. It's got to have equal relationship on both sides to make sense. You can't just say, well, if you don't wear a hat, you might as well shave your head. That's not equal relationship. We're talking about something that can be shorn or shaven. Now, I want to bring this up. Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:8, now we're moving from 1 Corinthians, but for a context of the New Testament, 1 Timothy 2:8, Paul said, I desire that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, in the like manner also. So we're connecting the women with the men here, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. Well, why in the world is Paul concerned about a woman's hairstyle if in fact early Christian women covered their heads? Remember, katakaluptos is fully covered their heads with a veil. Again, why would Paul be concerned? Not just, not adorned with braided hair. Why in the world is Paul concerned about a woman's hairstyle during prayer time if supposedly the first century Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? Who would have been able to see that their hair was braided? And so the presence of a prohibition such as this in the context of prayer argues forcibly that it was that hairstyle was actually being worn in the church services, and it was visibly seen by everyone. And so this in turn implies that it was not a custom for women wearing veils. Otherwise, how would Paul know that women were wearing braided hair in church? And scholars contend that 1 Timothy was written about 10 years after 1 Corinthians. So apparently the women in Ephesus weren't wearing veils during prayer time. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to correct them on their hairstyles. And then Peter gives a similar teaching about 13 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And Peter said, whose adorning, let it not be the outward adorning of plaiting the hair and wearing of gold or putting on apparel. So it's not just plaiting the hair, it's an outward adorning. So how could plaiting the hair be an outward adorning if supposedly Christian women fully covered their heads with the veil? And so the point I'm going to make is that they didn't. Women weren't praying with veils over their head where you couldn't see their hair. Otherwise, Paul and Peter wouldn't have any reason to be giving these corrective stance here. It wouldn't be necessary to warn women against wearing a particular hairstyle if their hair was being covered by a shawl or a veil. So looking at 1 Corinthians 11:15, the woman's hair is given to her for a covering. The main definition of auntie here, and this is from Dana and Manti, the main definition, Dana and Manti say there's conclusive proof now that the dominant meaning for auntie in the first century was instead of. By far the most commonest meaning of auntie is the simply instead of. This statement refers to the papyri use, and Professor Whitesell made a study of auntie in the Septuagint and found 38 passages where it is rightly translated instead of in the Revised Version. I have charts in my book. I go through every reference of auntie in the Septuagint and in the New Testament. The coin wasn't a substitute for Jesus. It wasn't given instead of Jesus. The coin was given in place of the taxes. That's replacement. And so hair is given for, or auntie, a covering. Would be like if we illustrate it this way, we could say that 4 quarters are given for or auntie a dollar bill. So we could say the 4 quarters auntie a dollar bill are given to him. We could say 4 quarters for a dollar bill are given to him. We could say that 4 quarters as a dollar bill are given to him. We could even say 4 quarters instead of a dollar bill are given to him. 4 quarters in the place of a dollar bill are given to him. Or we could say 4 quarters to serve as a dollar is given to him. And in each scenario, 4 quarters takes the place of or assumes the place of a dollar bill. In every case, do you know what's been given to him? 4 quarters. Just like to a woman is given her long hair for a covering. What's been given is the only thing that is required. Now, Clayton talked about comparison, and Clayton readily understands that comparison is not a normal definition or meaning of auntie. And in fact, he says that in a footnote in his paper that he wrote for the UGST symposium. He said, this meaning of auntie is rare. I'm going to go ahead and add to that and say that it's not just rare, it's almost non-existent. And so he says this is rare, and he cites, because I asked the question in the presentation, and then he added this footnote later. He said, thanks for reminding me, I want to add the footnote. So he cites Liddell Scott Jones, he cited Bailey's French Dictionary, and he also cites BDAG, Bauer Danker Art Gingrich, and says that auntie mentions, they mention equivalence, which is different than substitution, not necessarily the same as identity. But here's the problem with all this, to these references to Liddell Scott, Bailey's, and to Bauer. So Liddell Scott lists to mark comparison as the 5th possible definition behind, instead of, in place of, equivalence, exchange, and for the sake of. So you better have a very good reason to apply the most obscure meaning of auntie to 1 Corinthians 11:15, or it's just a desperate attempt to try to find some kind of source to validate this comparison view. Liddell Scott Jones, the examples that they cite under to mark a comparison date back to 380 BC. So we're not even talking about the same time frame of the Greek language of when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 11:15. And also the example cited under definition 5 from Plato is not even the same phrase as Paul references in 1 Corinthians 11:15. Bailey's Greek-French dictionary lists equal to and in comparison as possible definitions under the heading number 2 instead of, in place of. And the examples that he provides likewise denote substitution, where in the Iliad that Achilles alone is worth several armies. And in the Odyssey, it refers to a guest who takes the place of his brother. And again, these are 7th century BC references. And then finally, Bedag's citation of 1 Corinthians 11:15 under definition 2 as equivalence. And equivalence in comparison, they're not the same thing. But even under that, they say indicating that one thing is equivalent to another. And then Bedag qualifies this as for, as, in the place of, which is basically the same explanation they give in definition 1 in order to indicate that one person or thing is or is to be replaced by another instead of or in the place of. A very wise man once told me, we never say it can mean this. We say it does mean this. John, how much time do I have left?
You have 43 seconds.
Oh my goodness. Well, we may get into this part in the Q&A. So I won't even click the next slide.
All right. So you'll have to, I'm the host, but you'll have to keep me on track on the format. Are we now moving into a 10-minute cross exam?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'll have to reset my timer here. And again,
for the people listening, to explain the cross-examination, think of it more like an attorney asking a witness. So Clayton's going to ask me some questions. I'm going to answer the questions, and there's no debate back and forth.
Yeah, that's right.
He's not going to argue with the answers that I give. He's going to answer another one. And then I'm going to give him the same courtesy when I ask him my questions.
So they're more or less harvesting what they feel to be critical information from the opponent. All right. Thank you to the audience again for tuning in tonight, for all the comments. It's great to see the comment section being active. If you do have any questions for either one of the debaters, you can put those in the comments, and perhaps they will be able to respond to them at some point. So if you have a particular question you would like to follow up with Dr. Killion, then do so. And if you have a question that you would like to address to Dr. Weatherly, you can do that as well. And perhaps they will take the time at some point to provide a written response to the questions that you have for them. Maybe in a future debate, we didn't plan for it in this one, but maybe in a future debate, we can do a Q&A section where the debaters respond to live questions.
He can pick different debaters for that one, Clayton. I'll just say to the listening audience, again, Clayton and I are friends. We've had dinner together. We've served together in the symposium at UGST. And I think this was more, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this was a lot of arm twisting to get us to do this.
Yeah, it was. But it's fun. It's been great. There's positive comments about how respectful and what a positive demeanor and attitude that the both of you are keeping toward one another.
Good.
And I think this is going to serve as a beautiful example of how brothers can disagree on a secondary or tertiary issue within fellowship. And I think our movement so desperately needs that. I believe Clayton will be going first, right, in the Q&A section.
Yep. And he gets 10 minutes.
Okay. All right.
Not 10 minutes, 5 seconds, because I'm the one answering the questions.
So Clayton, as soon as you start speaking, I'm just reading some of these comments that are
Clayton, don't begin speaking yet. I'm going to make a suggestion to you, because I would like the opportunity to answer this. So the question that you asked, what sense does it make for Paul to use the vague kind of katakalupto language? if you want to ask me that, I kind of have an answer. I have an opinion. It's not really an answer, but I have an opinion. If you
Okay.
want to ask, you're not obligated to ask, but if you want to.
Okay.
So I will.
Are you ready? Are you starting your Q&A portion, Clayton, right now?
In after this sentence,
Okay.
I will ask you that question, Jason. Why did Paul use cover instead of just talk about hair straight away? I will ask you that question if you'll give me like an equivalent question so that I can also give my theory on this.
Okay.
One commenter said his little girl said that before we start telling her whether to wear a veil or not, we need to shave our beards. Like, okay, maybe that needs to be the next discussion.
Again,
This
like
is
Jason said, you can find different debaters.
One
Yeah,
of us
exactly.
doesn't have a beard, baby.
That's right. I think they were obviously talking about Clayton and I. All right, Clayton, when you get ready to when you start talking, I will hit the timer for 10 minutes.
Okay. Jason, do you believe that hair is the one and only covering discussed in 1 Corinthians 11? Or is Paul making any statement at all about other headwear, like a hat or a veil?
I don't think that he is specifically referencing a hat or a head covering. So by that, this is going to throw some people for a loop, but I will explain it. I don't think that Paul is saying that if a man prays or prophesies wearing a hat, he dishonors his head. So in that sense, I don't think he's talking about a hat. And I don't think that Paul is saying that a woman must wear a hat, a veil, a scarf, or whatever on her head. Because in the Old Testament, the priests and Levites were commanded to wear headgear on their head in doing the duties of a priest, which included praying, blessings, prophesying. That's not to say, though, that Paul is not playing both sides. And I will get to that when you ask me the question about what sense it made for Paul to use that language. I'll give you my opinion about what I really think Paul was doing here.
Okay, so with that in mind, if Paul is only talking about hair, why use the language of covering throughout the passage? Why not just come out and say, men do this, women do that?
Okay, so Paul is a very chiastic teacher, very chiastic arguer. And by chiastic, for those that don't know what that means, a chiasm is kind of like an X shape or a V shape. So from key, an X that looks like, so Xmas is not an X, it's a key. So a chiastic, so you have a point here, and then you work your way to a fulcrum, and then you work your way back. And Paul has a pattern sometimes of working the people against each other. So we see this in the book of Romans, the first 3 chapters, and a lot of what the contention in the first century was between Jewish and Gentile culture. A lot of the Jews thought that the Gentiles should become Jews first, apostolic Christians second. And that was the whole debate, 1 Corinthians 15, the law, circumcision, all that. So you kind of get a feeling of this. And the chiasms are not just within a chapter. There are commentators on 1 Corinthians that see like entire arguments. Some of them see 1 Corinthians 11, the opening of it, as being kind of this chiasm that's opening and closing an older chiasm where he's opening 1 Corinthians 11, and it's kind of the introduction to what he's about to get into in 12, 13, 14 with the gifts of the Spirit, and the closing with the Lord's Supper of arguments that he said prior about eating things offered to devils in the table of devils and table of the Lord. So as an illustration, in Romans 1, Paul basically says, he's starting this argument off, and he says, all the Gentiles are sinners. And then all the Jews that are hearing that will be like, hey, man, we told you, yeah, you're just the bad guys. And then in chapter 2, Romans, he was like, all the Jews are sinners, and then all the Gentiles. So he's working them back and forth, back and forth. And then in Romans chapter 3, it's like we're all sinners. So I think this is a kind of an argumentative way that Paul does. So people have tried to reconstruct, the grammatical, linguistic, forensic evidence of 1 Corinthians 11 to see what's going on. And this is just an opinion. This is the way that I understand it. We're going to argue until the Lord comes back on exactly what the issue in 1 Corinthians 11 was. I think there was an issue between Jewish and Roman culture. And I think that the Jews were trying to impose on the Gentile believers head coverings, because not only did the women wear a head covering, the men wore head coverings in the Jewish culture. And that the Gentiles were saying, no. Pulling a toga up over our head was something we did when we were pagans. And so Paul is playing them against each other in ambiguous language. And he says, every praying, prophesying man having something down the head dishonors his head. And so those that would say, oh yeah, we're talking about veils and hats, that you got to, the Gentiles saying, see there, we told you Jews that you're dishonoring your head. Then he says, with the woman, the praying or prophesying woman, not having her head covered dishonors her head. And so then the Jews would be like, see there, Gentiles, we told you. And then he says, for that is all one and the same as being shaven. And they're all like, wait, what are you talking about? Shaven? And then he gets to the point. If a woman's not wholly covered, let her also be shorn. Let her be cut short. But since it's a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her be covered. And then he gets to the whole point about creation, which you and I agree that point. We agree what kephale in relationship to headship means. And then he concludes to let them know, is it comely that a woman praying to God uncovered? And he's getting to the whole conclusion of kind of this back and forth argument that he's pit the two sides against each other. And he says, is it proper that a woman pray to God uncovered? Doesn't nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair? And here we get to the crescendo, that we're not talking about wearing a turban, your toga on top of your head as a covering and not a covering. We're talking about the issue of real thing is women are supposed to have long hair, and women are to have long hair because her hair is given to her instead of a covering, instead of a mantle. So I think he's pitting both sides against each other and is kind of using ambiguous language there.
Okay, interesting. Question.
Did we lose our host?
I think he backed out so that the screen could be.
Yeah, I just went off screen so that you two.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Q&A would be the primary focus of the screen.
Okay.
Okay. Greek grammar question for you, Jason. In verses 4 and 5 of 1 Corinthians 11, are the participles praying and prophesying articular or anarthrous? Do they have the definite article or not?
Oh man, don't put me on the spot like that, Clayton. You're asking a question where you already know the answer.
Okay.
I'm now going to pull up my Blue Letter Bible app. Okay. Why would you ask a question? You just wasted a question. You know the answer.
No. Okay, so because I'm not allowed to argue with you, I have to ask questions, right? It's cross-examination.
I got you.
So given that they are not articular, they lack the definite article, isn't it the case that anarthrous participles are adverbial in their force?
Possibly. Again, you're asking me a question that you already know the answer to, and you're catching me off guard with a grammar question. If you knew how long it's been since I was in a grammar class, but that's fine. I should have prepared for that one. I will say, even adverbial, it would be an incidental statement, a statement of incident, not necessarily a restrictive time. Kind of like when Jesus says, when you stand praying, forgive. Well, that doesn't mean that we only forgive when we stand praying. We've got to forgive when we sit praying. There's other examples too. There's other examples too of the participles being incidental. If a woman runs barefooted, she dishonors her feet. It doesn't mean that running barefooted is the only time that she would dishonor her feet being barefooted. So I don't think that praying or prophesying is that Paul is limiting it there. I'll get into that in my Q&A with you for some questions for you.
Okay.
It's either an incidental statement or he is describing the man and the woman as prophets or praying men, praying women.
Well,
Not necessarily limited to the time that they pray.
So that's what I'm asking, is because they don't have the definite article, wouldn't it be improper to say the praying man or the praying woman? Wouldn't they need to be articular?
I don't know that in Jeremiah or Ezekiel. I'd have to go back and look just to be fair. And it could have the article, but going back into Ezekiel and Jeremiah of the men praying, the daughters praying, just to verify whether those two or not. And those are, in both cases, they're translating the word for prophet and prophetess.
Okay, so how would your view change if these participles were in fact circumstantial? Any man in the circumstance praying or prophesying, having his head covered. Like if I'm right about the grammar of these participles, how would that affect your view?
You broke up. Say that again.
I'm sorry. If I'm right about how these participles are supposed to be understood, how would that change your view?
I don't know. I can't honestly, I'd answer how it would change my view. Even if they're used adverbally, it's still I would see it as an incidental phrase.
Okay.
All right.
It's not limiting to that time. It's just an incidental phrase.
All right. Time is up for Clayton's cross-exam. It is now time for Jason to cross-exam Clayton.
All right, Clayton, how much of the hair must be covered in order to obey 1 Corinthians 11, 5-6?
Paul doesn't specify, and so I don't think I can give a definitive statement. I don't want to go beyond Paul.
So, katakalupto, fully covered, wholly covered, would you say that that's the whole head or just a portion of the head?
So I don't think that it is the whole head in this sense, because the whole head would include the face as well. And we know, like, there are examples of katakalupto being used to describe covering the head where the face is still visible, where you can still see the face of the person. My position on katakalupto would be that Paul is describing an action. So women are told to cover their head with a head covering, but they're not told what to cover their heads with. So I don't think we should make pronouncements about what has to be a hat, or it has to be a veil, or it has to be, it's not allowed to be a headband or something like that. I think Paul is prescribing actions, not necessarily the thing to do the action with.
Okay, so you said headband. With that, would a large hair bow or a headband or even a large banana clip satisfy the meaning of covered in 1 Corinthians 11, 5-6?
Banana clip, no, I don't think so, because a banana clip is not a covering. It's an implement to hold the hair in place, but potentially a large hair bow or a very wide headband. Because I don't think Paul is telling us what to cover with. Just like I would say, if a man has on a ball cap, he should take that off to pray. If he's wearing a sweatshirt and he has, his hood pulled up, he should pull his hood down to pray. It's not about the item, it's about the action.
What if he has a sweatband around his head? Does he have to take the sweatband off in order to pray?
That I don't know. I'm inclined to say not, because something that wraps around the head does not cover the head, it encircles the head. That's a little bit different than the things that we see katakalupto or katacephalase echon being used with, like a himation, a toga. I would say that would be foreign to the vocabulary of the Apostle Paul. He's not talking about something encircling the head. Now, if it was like a really wide headband that like wrapped around the head, potentially, but not like, an exercise sweatband or something like that.
Okay. So we're not just talking about women wearing a cloth material on their head. We're including the men not wearing a clothing material on their head when they pray or prophesy. So is this an exclusive New Testament doctrine? And if so, when was it established?
Yes, it is a New Testament doctrine, just like the uncut hair doctrine is a New Testament doctrine. The Old Testament nowhere explicitly forbids women to cut their hair. It was a cultural norm, just like head covering was. It was a cultural norm. Women didn't cut their hair. It was a cultural norm. Women veiled their heads. But there was no specific like inspired prophetic or inscripturated response that you must do this in the Old Testament. And to answer the second half of your question, I believe that the practice began almost immediately. I don't think the New Testament gives us a specific time, but whenever the distinction of head coverings happened, by the time we get to 1 Corinthians 11, it's already the universal practice of the church, because verse 16 says, if anyone tries to argue about this, we have no such custom. We don't fight about this. This is just what we all do. So certainly, when was 1 Corinthians 11 or 1 Corinthians written? Like 50 AD. By the time we get to 50 AD, the practice is both established and universal.
So an ambiguous beginning, but at least by 50 AD, correct?
Yeah, just like I don't just like to go back to the circumcision thing, it was not immediately apparent whether or not Gentiles should circumcise in order to enter the church. For the first little while, that was an open question until the apostles spoke authoritatively on it. And I think it's the same thing with the head covering. This could have been, there could have been diversity. There could have been, different practices until the apostles spoke on it. And 1 Corinthians 11 is record of that.
Okay. I've got a few more questions, and then I'm going to ask John that at the end, whether I run out of time or not, that you have space to answer the question of what you think Paul was doing there. Okay. So you mentioned in a YouTube video that not wearing of veils is only about 70 years old. And you pointed to a 1969 National Organization of Women's demonstration. So by this, are you claiming that the wearing of veils was a universal practice for non-Catholic denominational churches?
So my PhD is in historical theology, and my area of focus is the first 700 years of Christianity. So I would be much more cautious making statements about what non-Catholics were doing in the 1800s or in the 1700s. But I would say that the practice of wearing a secondary covering was the majority report for most of Christian history, regardless of denomination. That's just a fact. And at least in America, the practice of not wearing head coverings was politically, not theologically motivated.
So going back to your statement, that the not wearing veils is only about 70 years old. And you pointed to 1969 demonstration. So again, are you saying that the Southern Baptist the largest the largest non-Catholic denomination in the United States, universally wore hats and veils up until 1969?
So I would want to distinguish between and I'm curious what the context of my statement was in that video, but I would want to distinguish between what the biblical position was that was taught versus what people were doing in the pew, because you could go into a UPC church and say, like, well, look, obviously they don't actually believe the uncut hair doctrine because there's women in the church with trimmed hair. But that practice, just because there are a few women who might trim their hair, that doesn't mean that the UPC doesn't teach the uncut hair doctrine. It's the same thing here. There is not, to my knowledge, anyone, certainly for the first 700 years of Christianity, that believed that hair was the one and only covering. All of them believed that some sort of secondary covering was in view, and even though that the comparative usage of anti is rare, that is how pretty much everybody understood anti.
I'm glad you said that, because I skipped that question. So I want to go back to 1 Corinthians 11:15, and I asked you in the symposium about the comparative view, and you stated back then that's how the patristics understood the passage as comparison. So when you say that, that's how the patristics understood 1 Corinthians 11:15. Do you mean all the patristics? Do you mean that? Are you implying that every patristic author commented on 1 Corinthians 11:15 and explained it as a comparative view?
I'm hesitant to just give an unqualified yes, so I will say this: I am unaware of any Christian commentator for the first 700 years who took a replacement view.
Time.
And at least in the case of John Chrysostom, he anticipates the replacement view in his homily 26 on 1 Corinthians. He anticipates the objection, oh, well, if long hair is enough, why do you need another? And then he corrects it. So I'm
So
unaware.
does that sound like Chrysostom knew of that other view? Anyway, hey, John,
Yes.
let's let Clayton go ahead and answer the question. What do you think Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians 11? And then
Okay,
we'll close out with our final comment.
Yeah. So I slightly, whenever
But don't take all night on this question.
Of course not. Whenever you were first talking about your theory, I wasn't exactly sure what you meant. I thought you were going to go a different direction. So I would just say two things on this point. One, I think that Paul uses hair terminology and covering terminology because he's talking about two different things, right? I think that that's just the straightforward, rather than, which I enjoyed your answer, Jason, but rather than these elaborate ideas of playing people off one another and he's trying to work the crowd, I think that Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, is the easiest one, which is that he talks about two different things because he's talking about two different things. The second thing I would say here is that if we're saying this is like a Jew versus Gentile situation, he's not trying to play the Jews off the Gentiles about head coverings, because according to Strack and Bilderbeck, in the first century, Jewish men were not yet covering their heads when they went into the synagogue. The custom of wearing a prayer shawl or a prayer hood had not yet become the established practice. And so when the apostles went into the temple, when the apostles went into the synagogue to pray, it is not certain that they were having to wear a veil in those contexts.
All right. So now I think we are moving into the closing arguments, right? Closing statements for 10 minutes apiece, or is that what it is? Or is it 10
Mhm.
minutes apiece? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Man, this has been
10 minutes
this has
apiece.
been
And I think I go first so that Clayton gets the final word.
all right. Yeah, that is correct. And man, this has been such a tremendous discussion tonight from both of you guys. It's been very informative, and I appreciate you guys doing this so very much. Whenever you get ready to go, Jason, you can have your final 10 minutes. Let me get my clock up here. All right. Whenever you're ready to go, I will start the timer for your final 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Clayton, once again for allowing an arm twist from John to get us and everyone else. For those of you that text me and said you were excited for the match of a lifetime, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Clayton and I are still friends. We're going to remain friends. I do want to say in the closing statement here in the last 10 minutes, a couple things about history, about patristic authors and things of that nature, just to kind of throw some information out there. Just taking the Ante-Nicene Fathers alone, of the 35 identifiable Ante-Nicene authors, we're not talking about the anonymous or the collective works. There's only two writers, Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, that explicitly address the practice of wearing veils. And of those two, only Tertullian references 1 Corinthians 11:15. So just of the Ante-Nicene Fathers alone, it is a stretch to say that the patristics held this view. And Clayton mentioned John Chrysostom, and that he was aware of a different view, that if a woman has long hair, she doesn't need a second covering. So even when Chrysostom mentions this comparable view, and they didn't use comparable for auntie, they just used it for the word nature. I would contend that Clement and Tertullian represent North African Christianity. They don't speak for the whole of Christianity. We could debate church history. I get into church history in my book. Matter of fact, for people that don't know, I updated it, the book in 2025. I go from the Ante-Nicene to the Nicene, post-Nicene, all the way to the medieval, all the way into the modern Pentecostal movement. So I went through even more of that. And to then say that the not wearing of veils is only 70 years old, and pointing back to a 1969 protest with the National Organization of Women, I think that's an extreme exaggeration. There's academic works that says that the veiling of women was not universally practiced. Fiddle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, so on and so forth. But we know that Southern Baptist didn't teach head coverings. We know that in the Pentecostal movement, in our Pentecostal movement, Trinitarians and oneness, the pictorial history does not support the idea that they were wearing head coverings. I mean, if they were wearing head coverings, and this was kind of the traditional Pentecostal view that a woman had to wear a hat or a veil, then why in the world would there have been an issue with Bishop Lawson and G.T. Haywood in the PAW? I mean, Bishop Lawson left the PAW over the issue of women preachers and head coverings. The same thing with the apostolic assemblies. So Francisco Lorente, he left the PAW over the issue of head covering. So this was not a universal practice, even among denominational folks, but especially among Pentecostals, Trinitarian or oneness. So this has not been, it's not something that's just been around. Not wearing veils has been around just for the less than 70 years. You can go through church history and you can find writers. You can find Epiphanius, who cites 1 Corinthians 11:7 as a man ought not to wear long hair. You can find the Council of Gongora that associates cutting the hair with renouncing their submission. And again, within our own oneness Pentecostal movement, major movements, two major organizations, the Cool JC and the Apostolic Assemblies, that have enforced artificial head coverings, and neither one of them have a formal statement. And I got friends that are Apostolic Assembly. I got friends that are Cool JC. I think the Cool JC is the coolest acronym of any oneness Pentecostal organization at all. And I've talked to them about this, and they said there's no formal written thing in our organization in the Cool JC about women wearing hats, women wearing veils. It's enforced through the local congregations. But again, that was a break from Bishop Lawson and Bishop Haywood. So if this was an idea of something that was not veiling, is only 70 years old, Haywood and Lawson predate 1969. So this is not, the hair view is not new. You can find people through the first 700 years of church history that considered a woman's hair to be her only needed covering. And you can find different views of that throughout church history. So I don't know where my time is, but I have a cuckoo clock beeping in the background of my office, so I'm going to mute my mic.
Jason, you have 5 minutes left.
That was the longest 5 minutes. I still got another 5 minutes out of 10 minutes.
Yes.
For a final statement. Okay. Well, Clayton, I love you. John, I love you. And I'll just say that as far as Tertullian and going back, because so many people bring up church history, I think that Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria were interpreting Paul through the cultural lens of their day, much how many of our oneness brethren interpreted passages about beards and shaving through the cultural lens of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. I don't know that Tertullian necessarily represents the correct view, and he may not even represent the majority view. He expressed that there were churches that did not require veils, that they had exemptions from women wearing veils. He had to write a special letter on the veiling of virgins. So it is not as universal as is often claimed. There's very blanket statements made by second covering advocates that everybody in church history, the women universally wore head coverings. And what's funny is when you get into the medieval and even into the Reformation period, you'll have people like Calvin talking about men shouldn't cover their head with anything, but then they make all these excuses of why they can do it. You know, they can wear a hat in the church and pray and prophesy in the church because it's cold in the church, or the altar boys can have a hat on. So they weren't very consistent in what they taught. So anyway, the long hair view is not a new view. The not wearing of veils is more than 70 years old, and it doesn't just all come from 1969 Catholic feminist movement of the National Organization of Women. Thank you everyone for being here. If you want to read more on it, I wrote a book, and I updated it in 2025. It's called A Woman's Glory, a look at headship, head coverings, and hair, and it is available on Amazon.
Yes, it is. And go and buy yourself a copy. All right. Clayton, it will now be your turn. And when you start, we will begin the final 10 minutes of this debate. And thank you again to everyone watching, commenting, and participating. We appreciate that so very much. Thank you to both of the debaters again. You're doing a great job. And as soon as Clayton starts speaking, I will start the final 10 minutes of the debate.
So I'm going to have to go on Amazon and get Jason's updated book, I guess, and check it out. Okay, so a couple points about church history, since that's kind of where we've drifted at the end, and then I'll have a few things to say. Jason points out that Clement and Tertullian were the only two of the ante-Nicene fathers to address head coverings, but then he also said that the Cool JC doesn't have a written statement on wearing head coverings, that it's just a cultural norm. It's just enforced, and it's the way it's done. That's kind of what I would claim if this were a history debate rather than a scriptural debate, is that we wouldn't expect to see people talking about it all the time if it is the common prevailing practice. It's just the done thing. Jason, you did say that Clement did not cite 1 Corinthians 11 in his argument for head covering. You said only Tertullian cites 1 Corinthians 11, unless I misheard.
11:15.
11:15. Okay. Because Clement does quote 1 Corinthians 11 throughout the passage. So just to recap, I would disagree with Jason that the participles praying and prophesying in verses 4 and 5, that those are either descriptive, like the praying man, the prophesying woman, or that they're just like an incidental statement that is irrelevant that you can just throw away. Rather, because of the grammar of the passage, these two participles are giving you the circumstances surrounding the action. So, to my point, it's not dishonoring for a man to cover his head. It's only dishonoring for a man to cover his head while praying or prophesying. And Jason pointed out, like, there's other ways that a woman could dishonor her head. Like, you can dishonor your feet by running through the mud, but there's other ways to dishonor your feet. Yes, that's true. But there are other ways to dishonor your head. But one of the ways that you dishonor your head is by praying or prophesying, having your head covered or not having your head covered, as the case may be. Now, I really think that verse 6 is one of the turning points of this debate. Verse 5 is one of the turning points of this debate. If the phrase "one and the same" really means one and the same, the way that Jason is emphasizing, then it equates being uncovered with being shaved, not with just trimming your hair. And if that's the case, then a man's head is not uncovered until it's shaved, because being shaved is one and the same with being uncovered. So I guess I can't pray because my head is not shaved. And a woman can cut her hair any length she likes, provided it's not shaved. Because again, being uncovered is one and the same with being shaved. Jason, I take your point about the preposition "anti," the equivalence view or the comparative view being extremely rare, and so we need to have a really good reason for this. I don't know if I would go so far as you did to say that it's extremely rare. Under the equivalence heading in BDAG, it lists 5 or 6 examples, which is small, but it's not crazy. But I would say that the very good reason that we have for taking this as a comparison rather than as a replacement is that all through the passage, Paul is using the language of covering. And if that's not referring to a secondary head covering, then we're left with the position that Paul spends all of this time using language that naturally, like I gave examples in the minds of Greek-speaking people alive during the time of Paul, this language would have conjured up the imagery of some sort of covering, some sort of physical object on the head. And we're to believe that Paul used this wide array of vocabulary to refer to head coverings. And then we get to verse 15 and, oh, no, I didn't mean head coverings. It's been about hair the whole time. You provided the suggestion that he was playing the crowd off of one another. But if Strack and Bilderbeck are correct, then there wasn't actually anything to play off of one another because Jewish men weren't actually covering their heads in the synagogue in the 2nd century. And lastly, just to return to the historical point for one moment, I would be curious, and maybe we can talk about this afterward, Jason, where Tertullian says that other churches weren't having women wear head coverings, because as I recall on the veiling of virgins, Tertullian seems to claim that head covering was the universal practice, and that the Corinthian church in his day was still practicing head coverings like they had been doing all along. It's true that he did have to write a special treatise to discuss whether or not virgins should veil their heads. But the reason for that is in antiquity, there was a cultural disagreement over what counted as a woman. Were you a woman simply by virtue of being female, or were you a girl until you were married, and then being married put you into the class of being a woman? And so the debate was not whether women had to cover their heads. At least in Tertullian's context, everybody seems to have agreed that women covered their heads. The question was, who counts as a woman? And with that, I think that's good. Thank you, Jason, for doing this. This was fun, and yeah, we can talk more about such things, maybe not in front of everybody.
All right, man, this was such a good discussion. I am thankful to have two of my friends on the channel tonight having this conversation for everyone to learn from and to glean from. Thanks again, Jason and Clayton, for doing this. And I know that those who tuned in to watch were very blessed by the conversation this evening. And most importantly, one of the primary goals for this has been to demonstrate how brothers can disagree and still remain friends and charitable. It happens in other segments of Christianity. You have like the James Whites and Michael Browns who will both debate each other and team debate against others, depending on the venue. And I've always wanted to see this modeled within our particular corner of Christianity. And I appreciate both of you for taking the opportunity to do that this evening. All right. Thanks so much, guys, and to the audience. If anybody would like to support Forward Talk in any financially, you can do so through the Cash App link that is on the page there. Jason, I will also try to put your book links in the show notes whenever it gets on YouTube. If it's too late to do it there, I will definitely post links to your hair book in the comments on Facebook, and Clayton, your blog as well. We will make sure that people have links to go see your blog and all the great content that you have on your blog page. All right, guys, any final words that you want to say before we're done?
I just think somebody needs to close out with prayer.
All right, let's do it. Father, in the name of Jesus,
rip,
we
John.
thank you. Thank you for this opportunity for us to gather tonight. Thank you for this time of not just debate and conversation, but time of fellowship. I thank you for the way that both Jason and Clayton demonstrated Christian love and charity, and the exhibition of their scholarship, having labored to earn PhDs in biblical disciplines. Father, I thank you for their work and labor. I thank you for the influence that they are going to have in the kingdom of God for many years to come. And Lord, we appreciate Forward Talk having the opportunity to be a venue for their knowledge and their wisdom tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I am going to end the live stream here. Have a great night. God bless. Yeah, okay. All right.